You're listening to the Manage My Home podcast, the podcast for property owners who would like help with their rental properties. This show is based on the RPM WV Phoenix team's experience in leasing and managing homes and will give you useful advice and tips to succeed with your rental property. And now, from Phoenix, Arizona, here is Lisa from RPM WV Phoenix.
Hi, welcome to Manage My Home. This is Lisa with RPM Phoenix Valley. The next couple of podcasts, we are going to talk about things to include in your lease agreement and the reasons behind why we suggest including those items. So each month we're going to touch on 3 or 4, and then the next month 3 or 4, so that by the end of the series you'll have some really great things and a list of things to always make sure you include in your lease agreement. And of course, outside of this list of specifics, you're going to have the general items that everyone would include, such as landlord name, your name, tenant's name, property address, start and end date of the lease, full amount of the rent, and then how the rent can be paid, whether it's certified funds into a bank account, etc. So the 4 topics that we're going to talk about today are late fees, notice fees, occupant names, and then appliances. So starting with the first one, which is late fees. So we always recommend that you have a specific late fee per day rather than just charging one late fee after the initial day that they're late. The reason behind this is that if you have the per day late fee, then the tenant has some incentive to pay sooner rather than later. For example, if they pay on the 4th day, they might owe $20, where if they pay on the 6th day, they'll owe maybe $40. That's the issue. Sometimes we see lease agreements where people will only do one late fee after the initial date that they're due. And that's the main reason we don't recommend that, is because it really doesn't give the tenant any incentive to pay on the 4th rather than paying on the 30th. The second thing that we always like to mention to people writing their own lease, because we see this a lot in lease agreements that we get from other, either from self-managed properties or from like real estate agents, is there is never a legal notice fee to the tenant. So what that means is that the owner will then be the one that has to pay for any kind of legal notice service fee to the tenant. And one of the biggest legal service notice fees you can have is the rent demand notice to start the eviction process. So we suggest that in your lease agreement, you detail how much that fee will be and that the tenant is responsible for that fee. The third item is we suggest that you include the names of all occupants somewhere in the lease, including minors. And then with the minors, you list their date of birth in the lease. Reason behind this is that if it's sometime you're going to go in to do an inspection, it makes it a lot easier for you before you do the inspection to know exactly how many occupants, adults and minor breakdown, are supposed to be living in the home. So that when you go to do the walkthrough, you can keep your eyes open carefully to see if it's looking like there are additional people living in the home outside of what's on the lease agreement. And then the last topic for today is we suggest in the lease agreement that you're very specific about what appliances you're including the optional appliances of the fridge, washer, dryer. And we also suggest in that lease agreement that you are specific about who's responsible for the repairing of the optional items. So for example, if you want to leave a washer, dryer, and fridge for the tenant, but if something should happen to them while the tenant's in place, not be responsible for repairing or replacing them, it's important that you include that information in the lease. And then pretty much throughout all of these segments, one main theme that we're going to always have is that the more detailed your lease can be and the more specific, really the better for everybody. Because this way, both you and the tenant know exactly who's responsible for what going into the process. And then our tip for today kind of relates to the lease agreement and how rents are paid. So we don't suggest that you allow a tenant to direct deposit the rent into a bank account for you. The reason behind this is if the tenant pays rent short, there's really no way for you to reject that payment. And once it goes into your bank account, you've accepted the rent, and therefore the tenant will then not be responsible for any portion of the rent that they didn't pay. So we suggest that you instead make sure that you're getting a physical payment from them, whether it's certified funds, a cashier's check, something tangible, so that if they don't pay in full, you have a way of rejecting that payment in full rather than ending up having to accept a partial payment that you may not want to accept. So thank you for joining us. Join us next time. We will talk about 4 more items on the lease agreement that we recommend it be included.